The general recommendation is to apply more nitrogen to feed barley compared to malt barley. This seems reasonable, as applying more nitrogen to malt barley will result in excess of protein and rejection by maltsters. With feed barley, high protein is not an issue and there is less risk in pushing yields with higher rates of N. Excessive grain protein in barley is not desirable as it results in cloudy beer and no one wants that. Maltsters may reject barley with protein levels above 12.5% unless there's abundance of low protein barley. In this video, we'll be seeing if the results support the notion to apply more nitrogen to feed barley. The studies we will be discussing were conducted by various agrogram sites from across Saskatchewan and were financially supported by Adopt and Sask Barley. The notion to apply more nitrogen to feed barley is fairly prevalent. The Saskatchewan Crop Planning Guide assumes producers in the black soil zone are applying 99 pounds of nitrogen to achieve a 93 bushel per acre crop of feed barley, and only 81 pounds of nitrogen to achieve 76 bushels of malt barley. The message here is to apply higher rates of nitrogen to feed barley and expect higher yields. If we look at the soil test recommendation calculator, you can see that N recommendations for an 80 bushel barley crop is 101 pounds for feed and only 85 pounds for malt. Why the difference? Are they assuming malt barley is more responsive to applied N? That is not likely the reason. The reason is likely due to fear of recommending too much nitrogen for malt barley. Too much nitrogen equals too much protein, which equals unhappy malt barley producers. Now I'll turn it over to Mike, who will cover the results from our agrogram studies and see if our results support the notion of applying more nitrogen to feed barley.
Thanks, Heather. The studies I will be covering were somewhat different in each year. In 2017, the feed variety CDC Ossitson was compared against the malt variety AC Metcalf at N rates of 40, 80, and 120 pounds per acre. The yield difference between these varieties is quite large. In 2018, CDC Ossitson was compared against CDC Bow, which is a malt variety that is higher yielding than AC Metcalf, but it's still lower yielding than CDC Ossitson. N rates for the comparisons in that year were 50, 75, and 100 pounds per acre. In 2019, CDC Ossitson was compared against the malt variety AAC Synergy, which is quite comparable in yield. The N rates in this study were also included the soil N reserves in the top 24 inches of soil. Thus, applied rates sound considerably larger than they did in the past because they're also including the soil N. The levels compared were 80, 120, and 160 pounds per acre. In total, there were 18 location years, but I'm only going to report on 8 locations. The locations I've discarded were either unresponsive or had wonky yield responses to added N, and have been removed from this discussion. Each graph in this presentation has the same yield scale on the left, so that differences in yield responses between locations is easily apparent. The bottom scale represents increasing nitrogen, and the right-hand scale is the percent grain protein. The gray line shows the percent protein as N rates are increased, and the gray arrow shows the point at which 12.5% protein has been exceeded. This represents the point at which malt barley would have been rejected for malt. The orange line represents the yield response of feed barley, like CDC Ossitson, and the blue line represents the yield response of the malt variety. Just think Labatt's Blue and you'll remember blue line is for malt. The arrows point to the most economical rate of nitrogen for the feed and malt barley. At this point, $1 per acre of nitrogen will return $1 per acre of revenue. The economic analysis is based on $4.68 per bushel for malt and $3.70 per bushel for feed. Keep in mind that this difference is relatively small, which favors the relative return for feed. So, this is Indian Head in 2017. The malt barley AC Metcalf was most economic at 94 pounds of nitrogen per acre, whereas the most economic rate for the feed barley variety CDC Ossitson was less than 91 pounds of N per acre. At Scott in 2017, the yield and response to added nitrogen was much lower. Not surprisingly, the most economic rates of N were much lower for both malt and feed. At this site, the optimum N rate was slightly higher for feed at 43 pounds of nitrogen compared to less than 40 pounds of nitrogen for malt. In 2018, the comparison is now between Ossitson and the higher yielding malt variety CDC Bow. However, Austenson is still a fair bit higher yielding than Bow. The most economic rate was 96 pounds of nitrogen for malt, and more than 100 pounds of nitrogen would have been required to maximize economic returns for feed. As an aside, there was never an interaction between variety and rate of nitrogen. In other words, while the yield often differed between varieties, their responses to added nitrogen did not. For example, adding 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre might increase the feed variety from 80 to 100 bushels per acre. And that same 50 pounds of nitrogen might increase the malt variety from 60 to 80 bushels per acre. Now, there's different yields between the varieties. The feed variety is yielding more than the malt variety, but the yield increase was the same for the two, 20 bushels. So an argument could be made that you should just use the same yield response curve when determining the economics for both feed and malt varieties. If this is done, the optimum N rate for malt will beat feed because malt is worth more per bushel. Of course, this is only true if malt isn't rejected because of excessive protein. However, from our discussion, I'll keep all the yield response curves for feed and malt separate. At Melfort in 2018, the yield responses were quite high, and the most economic rate of N for both varieties would have been a fair bit beyond 100 pounds of nitrogen. In other words, I can't determine the most economic rate of N, but it would have been much higher than 100 pounds of nitrogen even for the malt variety. As you can see, protein levels are still low. At Scott, you need to watch where the gray arrow is located. Even the lowest rate of N resulted in an excessive protein level to be accepted for malt. So 77N is not the most economic rate for malt. It would have been below 50 pounds of nitrogen. In contrast, the most economic rate of N for feed would have been considerably higher at 80 pounds of nitrogen.
At Indian Head in 2018, the most economic rate for malt barley was considerably higher at about 100 plus pounds of nitrogen, compared to only 79 pounds of nitrogen required for feed barley. In 2019, the malt barley comparison changed to AAC Synergy, which yields very similarly to CDC Aussitsen. Note the N scale at the bottom has changed to include soil nitrogen. At this site, the most economic level of nitrogen was considerably higher for malt compared to feed. Soil N reserves at this site were 32 pounds per acre. So at 155 pounds of nitrogen per acre being the most economic rate for malt, 32 pounds were from soil and 123 pounds were from the applied fertilizer. At Yorkton, both varieties were highly responsive to added nitrogen, so the most economic level for both was somewhere beyond 160 pounds of N per acre, which includes the soil N, which just happened to be also 32 pounds of nitrogen per acre at this site.
In summary, there were 3 cases where the most economical rate of N for malt and feed barley was essentially the same. There were 2 cases where the most economic rate of N was substantially higher for malt than feed barley. And there was 1 case where the most economical rate for malt would have been much lower due to protein issues. Then, there were 2 cases where comparisons were not possible because the yield response was quite steep for both varieties and the most economical rate was well beyond the rates investigated in the study. However, all in all, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest the most economic rate of N for feed barley is higher than that for malt. Keep in mind that these comparisons were also made with a relatively narrow price range between feed and malt. If the price of feed was even lower, this would have reduced the economic rate of nitrogen even further for feed. Conclusions. Metcalf is the lowest yielding variety, followed by CDC Bow and then Synergy. AAC Synergy essentially yields as well as the feed variety CDC Austenson. With Synergy, there may be little reason to be growing a feed variety. If Synergy has to go for feed, you haven't sacrificed any yield by growing it instead of Austenson.
I'd just like to add at this point that Canada Malt is no longer contracting Synergy for 2020. Others, like Raw and Bort Malt, who acquired Prairie Malt, are still contracting it. There are also other line companies that have demand for AAC Synergy. However, we've likely seen the peak adoption for Synergy.
There is also little evidence to suggest that more nitrogen should be applied to a feed variety.
Now, I'm not bold enough to tell you should be applying more nitrogen to your malt barley. The proper rate is something you have to determine based on your experience and the anticipated environmental conditions. However, I will suggest to you that if your malt barley protein is near 12%, you would not likely benefit from applying more nitrogen to your feed barley relative to your malt.
Again, I'd like to thank Adopt and SAS Barley for their financial support.